Hey there, I'm Jacob Strenger, the sixth grade language arts teacher at Thermopolis Middle School in Thermopolis, Wyoming. I wanted to talk to you about PLC questions 1 and 2. What do we want our students to learn and do? And how do we know when they've learned it? But more importantly, I want to provide you with a teacher's perspective on what it's like to work through those two PLC questions as a collaborative team. So let's begin with PLC question 1. What do we want our students to learn and do? Now, believe it or not, 10 years ago, teachers at Thermopolis Middle School were attempting to teach a majority, if not all, of their content standards. So to put that in perspective, a language arts teacher has about 18 standards for reading literature and reading informational text. When we throw in the writing standards and the language standards, we have over 30 standards a teacher may have attempted to teach and assess in an academic year. Now, the problem with this practice is that we made a commitment to all students when we decided to go on this PLC journey. We came to a consensus that all students were capable of learning at high levels. When I'm teaching 30 standards in one academic year, I'm not setting students up to be successful. In fact, I'm not even providing enough skill practice for students to take an assessment at the end of a 1, maybe 2-week unit. So as you can imagine, this practice did not last long. The first big step in our PLC journey was establishing essential standards for each content level. So the language arts team got together 5 through 8, and we had a conversation about what was most essential. What did we really want our students to master at each grade level in one academic year? Now, fortunately, our state provides us with state assessment blueprints. These blueprints tell us what standards are going to be addressed on the state assessment. They tell us what percent of the assessment will deal with each standard. So this was a huge document for us in establishing our essential standards at the middle school. But we didn't stop here. Once we had essential standards 5 through 8, we took our standards to the high school. We had a long conversation as a 5 through 12 language arts team about what it means to be college, military, and career ready. We wrote a whole list of skills students would need to leave our district with to be successful regardless of the path they chose. After we did that, we went backwards. What do students need to learn in 12th grade, 11th grade, all the way down to 5th grade in order to achieve these skills, to master these skills when they leave our school system? And through this conversation, we made some edits to all of our essential standards. We added a few standards. We talked about maybe removing a few standards. But at the end of the day, we came up with a list of standards 5 through 12 that we deemed essential. And so here's the document that we actually created after that conversation. And you'll see that this is still a working document. We last updated it in August this year when we started our summer curriculum work. Right? Every year we start our work, we want to make sure that the standards we deem essential are still truly essential. So this was a great place for us to start in our PLC journey. This allowed us to identify where we needed to focus our teaching and our assessment development. So for about 2 years, we started teaching these essential standards, but we ran into a snag. We didn't really see assessment data start to move. Our students were still maybe 55% proficient or advanced in language arts at the state level. And in some cases, we were 33 and 37% proficient. We weren't fulfilling our commitment to all students. We were leaving a lot of kids behind. And the reason for that is because the way I was interpreting a standard, the methods I was using to teach it, the academic vocabulary I was using, didn't really align with what the 7th grade teacher was doing in his room. And it didn't really align with what the 5th grade teacher was doing in her room. We were kind of just taking shots in the dark, hoping we were hitting these essential standards the right way. And so really the biggest eye-opener for us as a language arts team at the middle school came when we took a staff trip over the mountain to Sheridan, Wyoming. We participated in a workshop put on by Dr. Thomas Manny of Solution Tree. And it was here he explained to us that collaborative teams need to participate in a 3-step process. Step number 1 is identifying essential standards. Step 2 is unpacking or deconstructing those standards into a series of learning targets. And finally, turning those learning targets into a set of I can statements, student-friendly I can statements. we still felt pretty good about the essential standards we had chosen a few years prior. We weren't ready to give up on these yet, but we didn't really think to go beyond that. So when we returned from that workshop to begin our curriculum work, we knew this was our next big step. We needed to unpack and deconstruct these standards. We also had to be realistic. We couldn't unpack and deconstruct all of our essential standards in one 30-hour curriculum work week. So we agreed to get our feet wet. Let's start with 3 standards, RI1 and 2 and RL1. We find these to be kind of umbrella standards. The skills associated with these standards really apply to a lot of the other standards. So this was a good spot to start. Once we agreed to do this, we kind of split up. I went back to my room and I kind of went through a process that looked like this. I took my standard, RL1, which says cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. And as I started thinking about this standard, I thought it most natural to break this standard into 2 chunks. Support what the text says explicitly and support what the text says while making inferences. Once I did this, I started playing with some different ideas. I started trying to construct some learning targets that would be aligned to each one of these chunks. And I came up with a list of learning targets. This is an example of what I came up with back then. Now, while I was going through this process, the 5th grade teacher was doing the same thing. The 7th and 8th grade teachers were doing the same thing with their version of this standard. Then we came back together as a team. We looked at the standard and learning targets at each grade level. We had a lot of conversation about why we chose these learning targets. How does your standard read versus my standard, right? And this wasn't easy. We had a lot of disagreements along the way, but we had a goal in mind. We needed to unpack these standards. And at the end of the day, we came up with a series of learning targets for our essential standards at each grade level. And as we worked through this process, we started to finally come to a consensus of what these standards actually are asking students to do. We were starting to identify academic vocabulary that was essential that we use at each grade level. We even started to develop some strategies students could use while working through these standards, right? So this is the first time we were finally aligning ourselves as to what these standards mean and what students need to do. And so at the end of the day, we all kind of ended up with our own document that looked like this. We have our standard, our I can statement, and then we have our learning targets for that standard. And I like to organize my chart like this. I have approaching level targets, which are skills students can demonstrate to show that they are starting to grasp the concepts of this standard. And then I have the meeting level targets, which are skills students can demonstrate to show that they are mastering this standard. Now, this is really something that is important to note. We did not have to recreate the wheel here. We did not have to do this from scratch. There are a ton of resources available to us as teachers. So 2 of the resources I used to really help me think about these standards differently were WikiTeacher. They have a tab called Unwrap Standards. You just find your grade level and content area, and there is a ton of resources available. Vocabulary, anchor standards, learning targets, even teaching suggestions. And then the Groveport-Madison School District also went through this process, and they publish their standard charts for each grade level and content area online. You can simply Google. And these were a really good place to look into work and documents to work with while we were unpacking our standards. Now, once we started to make it very crystal clear what we wanted students to know and do, the next step was to figure out how we knew students were learning this material. Now, like any good teacher, we know that if we teach without stopping, without slowing down to see where students are at, we're going to miss opportunities to address misconceptions along the way. I'm going to miss an opportunity to address a specific student need before it becomes bad habit. So, like all good teachers, I'm constantly collecting data on my students' performance with each skill practice, right? I'm trying to identify misconceptions along the way. I'm trying to find individual student needs and deal with them in real time so they don't become issues later on. But the best way for us to know our students learning this material is through common informative assessments. Now, like I said, a couple of years ago, we established essential standards. We also started developing we started developing assessments aligned to these essential standards. But just like I was teaching a little bit differently than the 7th and 5th grade teacher, I was also assessing quite differently than the 5th and 7th grade teacher. So now that we had identified learning targets for each essential standard, I just went back to my room. I put my assessment in front of me, and I went through it with a fine-tooth comb. There were assessment items on there that had nothing to do with the learning targets we just identified. Those assessment items had to be removed. There were a ton of learning targets that I wasn't even assessing yet. So I had to develop and create assessment items to make sure that if I was deeming a skill necessary as a learning target, that I was also assessing it. There needs to be assessment items for each and every learning target. And again, after I went through this process, I went back to my team. We pulled our common assessment for RL1 at the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade level. We looked at the learning targets. We made sure that the assessment items were truly aligned to those learning targets. We edited, we modified, we adapted these assessments in real time as we were having these conversations. And we developed a series of common assessments, 5 through 8, so students could demonstrate an understanding, a mastery of each and every essential standard. And here's what's really great about this process. When we worked to create these documents that show the standard and learning targets, all I had to do after creating my assessment was add a few columns and rows, provide some areas for me to record scores for each learning target, and I essentially have a proficiency scale that I can lay on top of my assessment. I can see which assessment items are aligned to each learning target, and there's a spot for me to record a score for each of those learning targets. And this makes data analysis super easy. I organize my data chart the same way. I have my approaching level skills, I have my meeting level skills, and I have the student performance in each one of those areas. This really helps me identify if there are trends. Are students struggling in one area more than others? Did I drop the ball as a teacher and not address one of these learning targets enough? Or are there just students who maybe aren't ready yet? Or they've mastered their approaching level skills, but they're just not quite at the proficiency level yet, right? And this really sets me up to be successful moving forward with PLC questions 3 and 4. What am I going to do for students who aren't learning? And what am I going to do for those who have?